Welcome everybody. A very good evening. We welcome you to the second series of our Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. The meeting was really nice last Thursday. It was really encouraging, and the reviews that we got from everybody, the response that we got is really heartening. We already have 75 members registered in the society already, and we are expecting more to go today. And we will be having our first general body meeting on the 4th, and let's see how far we can carry this initiative. So without much ado, I will hand over the talk to I will introduce Dr. Vinod Raina, who's a very senior consultant medical oncologist now practicing in Gurgaon and NCR. So over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be joining this group. This is the first time I'll be joining this Asian Cardio-Oncology Society meeting. Basically, Parvesh has been very keen that I should attend. So I'm glad that I'm here, and I'll let the things roll on, and maybe Parvesh can introduce us to the program.
Okay, thank you very much, Vinod. Today our keynote speaker is Dr. Alok Khurana, and he is none other than the architect behind the Corona score that we are using. He is a medical oncologist and hematologist from Cleveland Clinic. He was also past chair of the American Society of Clinical Oncology Clinical Practice Guidelines Panel, and his research program is focusing on predictive factors, which is the Corona score, and drug development in cancer-associated thrombosis as well as in gastrointestinal cancer. So over to Dr. Alok, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Alok Khurana. I'm a medical oncologist and director of the GI cancer program at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you very much for this invitation to present some of our work regarding the prediction and prevention of cancer-associated thrombosis. This phenomenon of cancer-associated thrombosis, of cancer patients developing blood clots, is not a new phenomenon. As far back as the 1860s, this was reported most famously by Armand Trousseau, who was a French physician who's well known for a number of different aspects of medicine and surgery, who delivered this famous lecture in England, talking about what he had observed in a series of several patients, the development of blood clots in patients before they were diagnosed with cancer. And in fact, he pointed out that if a patient develops a blood clot and you're considering a list of differential diagnoses, keep malignancy in mind because of this association of blood clots with cancer. So he says very explicitly in this lecture, should you, when in doubt as to the nature of an infection of the stomach, when hesitating between chronic gastritis, simple ulcer, or cancer, so that's your three differential diagnoses, observe a vein become inflamed in the arm or leg, you may dispel your doubt and pronounce in a positive manner that there is cancer. In other words, that if a clot happens, it's much more likely to be due to a malignancy than due to an underlying benign condition. This phenomenon, therefore, is known as Trousseau syndrome. It's also one of those rare instances in medical history where the person after whom the syndrome is named actually suffers from the syndrome himself. It was just a very few years after he made this famous speech and published this case series of patients with malignancy presenting with clot. He woke up on New Year's Day in 1867 and called his student in and said, "I'm lost. The phlebitis that has appeared tonight leaves me no doubt about the nature of my illness." And indeed, he was very accurate about that as well. He developed a brand new phlebitis, and just a few months later was diagnosed with stomach cancer and died in the middle of 1867 of metastatic gastric cancer. So one of those very rare instances where the eponym, the person after whom the syndrome is named, is both the discoverer of the syndrome and also somebody who suffers from the same illness. In 2020, where do we stand in terms of the scope of the problem? Although most of my talk today will be devoted to venous thromboembolism, it's important to note that cancer-associated thrombosis involves both venous and arterial disease. In the graph on the left, you can see rates of venous thromboembolism in patients with cancer compared to non-cancer controls who have the same age and the same number of comorbidities. And in this analysis of about 17,000 patients compared with 17,000 controls, we see about a 12% rate of VTE compared to just 1.4% in non-cancer controls. And this extends to higher rates of DVT, PE, and DVT and PE. Similarly, arterial rates are also very increased. The 6-month cumulative incidence of arterial events is about 4.7% at 6 months after a new diagnosis of cancer, as shown on the right. And that includes a 2% rate of MI and a 3% rate of stroke. So very prevalent in the cancer population. It's also very consequential. So on the left is a graph of causes of death that we analyze in cancer patients receiving outpatient chemotherapy. So this is a very healthy population. Most patients had a performance status of 0 or 1. Most patients were being treated in the community in the United States, coming in for chemotherapy once a week or once every 3 weeks. And then if some of them died while they were getting chemotherapy, we asked the physicians treating them, what do you think is the cause of death? And it's a cancer population, so of course cancer progression was the #1 cause of death, 71%. But venous and arterial events together accounted for almost 1 in 10 deaths. 9% of all deaths were from this, tying with infection as the second leading cause of death. So direct impact on mortality is one of the biggest consequences of thrombosis. There's also an indirect impact on mortality that we don't fully understand. And that's shown in the graph on the right, where if you follow patients who develop a venous thromboembolism, and if you match them for the type of cancer and the stage of cancer and the type of chemotherapy that they're getting, invariably across different types of malignancies, different types of regimens, you will find that cancer patients who develop a venous thromboembolism have worse mortality than cancer patients who don't. We don't fully understand this phenomenon, but it's been observed over 2 or 3 decades now across a variety of different studies. And in the same study population that I just described for the pie chart on the left, you also see the Kaplan-Meier curve for VTE versus without VTE, and the hazard ratio adjusted for these other causes of mortality is still very high, 4.7. And finally, there are non-mortality associated consequences as well. Cancer patients with VTE have an increase in all-cause hospitalization. If they're hospitalized, the chance that they stay longer in the hospital is greater. So there's a 3-fold increase in days in hospital. And in the United States, the total healthcare costs are substantially greater in cancer patients who develop VTE versus cancer patients who do not. Now, even though this is a phenomenon that we've seen for 100+ years, we don't have a good explanation as to why this occurs. And I think as oncologists, we need to sort of ask this question repeatedly, which is, why are components of the coagulation cascade overexpressed or activated across multiple malignancies? Why in pancreatic cancer and in primary brain tumors and in lung cancer and in lymphoma are all these components of coagulation activated, even if not everybody develops a venous event? And why do clinical thrombotic events so commonly complicate cancer therapy? And why, if they do complicate cancer therapy, are they associated with consistently worse survival across all these malignancies? So again, an old phenomenon, still very prevalent in the cancer population, and we still don't have a full grasp on why this occurs. A couple clues as to sort of the pathophysiology of cancer-associated thrombosis. One of the things that is very striking is that tissue factor, which you'll recall from medical training, is the physiologic initiator of coagulation. And tissue factor expression occurs very early in some types of cancers. Here, for example, is our analysis of looking at pancreatic cancer. So before a normal pancreas transforms into pancreatic cancer, it undergoes a series of transformative steps, which are broadly called as pancreatic intraepithelial neoplasia, or PANNs. And what happens is that a normal duct becomes dysplastic, then fully dysplastic, and then eventually it becomes cancer. The 2 pictures on the left show a duct that is just starting to become dysplastic all the way on the left. In fact, it's so early that the top half of the duct is dysplastic, but the bottom half is actually still normal. And in that very first step, where half the duct is becoming dysplastic, you see tissue factor expression in the dysplastic portion, but not in the normal cuboidal epithelium. Similarly, the picture in the center shows a fully dysplastic duct. The whole duct is dysplastic, and all of it is expressing tissue factor. All around it, you see the normal pancreas. It is not expressing tissue factor. There's no reason for pancreas to express tissue factor because you don't have bleeding into the pancreas. So you don't need to clot in that area. And so again, that brings us to the question, why? Why is tissue factor so important for transformation of pancreas into pancreatic cancer? That tissue factor expression is one of the first steps that occurs in this pathogenesis. One of the hypotheses that we postulated and which we proved to some extent was that it is very possible that tissue factor promotes angiogenesis. In this study, we found that tissue factor expression was associated with VEGF expression and was associated with increased median microvessel density, which is sort of counting blood vessels in a high power field and is a surrogate for how much angiogenesis there is. Another very interesting hypothesis is that the activation of coagulation may be important for suppression of anti-tumor immunity. And as we get deeper into our understanding of tumor immunity, we find that in data that just came out, honestly, just not even a year ago, that expression of tissue factor, so you see here the prothrombin is transformed to thrombin. Thrombin interacts with the PARs, which are protease activated receptors, which are present on the surface of tumor cells. And this activation of coagulation leads to the pancreatic cancer actually suppressing anti-tumor immunity, which allows the tumor to grow and metastasize. And it's believed that the loss of PAR1 leads to failed tumor growth because there's enhanced immune-mediated clearance of tumor cells. So if you have PAR upregulation and thrombin is able to work downstream from that pathway, then you see suppression of anti-tumor immunity, which leads to increased tumor growth and metastases. So both these hypotheses, promotion of angiogenesis and promotion or suppression of anti-tumor immunity, suggest that the activation of coagulation is actually really important in early stages of cancer transformation for cancers to grow and to metastasize. And that may be an explanation for why coagulation activation is so prevalent across different types of cancers and especially in very early stages of cancer. And in fact, if this is the case, then you would expect that tissue factor expression would be associated with decreased survival. And we find that in different types of cancers, in colorectal cancer, in liver cancer, in pancreatic cancer, and our series of 100+ patients in pancreatic and biliary cancers, all of these consistently showing that high tissue factor expression on tumor cells or high levels of circulating tissue factor in the blood of patients with pancreatic and biliary cancers are all associated with worsening of survival, from supporting the hypothesis that it's important for tumor growth and metastasis. As a result, several therapeutic approaches have now been developed to target tissue factor as a target in cancer, not to reduce the rate of DVT or PE, but to actually target tumor cells. We just published a recent analysis of a drug, a small molecule called PCI-27483, which is not a classic anti-TF antibody, but it's a TF7A inhibitor. There's some signal there that in pancreatic cancer, when combined with gemcitabine, that improves to some extent progression-free survival. More work needs to be done in that area. A second way to use tissue factor as a target is to actually conjugate something with an anti-tissue factor antibody. The picture on the right is one such molecule that's been developed by Seattle Genetics that takes tissue factor as a target, but then uses a conjugate that is brought into the tumor cells because so many tumor cells are expressing tissue factor. This is now being studied in 3 different clinical trials in cervical cancer, solid tumors, and ovarian cancer. And hopefully we'll have results for this type of approach by the end of this year. Now, not everything is driven by tissue factor. As we understand better about the molecular classification of different types of cancers, we find that specific molecular subtypes are associated with higher rates of DVT or PE. These are data that we just recently presented at the end of last year in ASH, and we have a paper that's almost ready to go. This work was done by the three of my trainees shown here, Joanna Rupkumar, Shyam Podell, and Lorenzo Garvazo. And what they found was that if you looked at rates of ATE by the type of lung cancer mutation, the highest rates were observed in patients with ALK mutant lung cancer. In fact, they were so high that I've never actually seen such a high rate in any other type of disease. 43% of ALK mutant lung cancers had a DVT or PE. Obviously, patients with ALK mutant lung cancers live longer because of the targeted therapy. But even if you look at 6 months, the cumulative VTE rates are about 15% for ALK mutant compared to 8% for EGFR mutant and 9% for wild type lung cancers, suggesting that specific pathways, oncologic pathways, may also drive the rates of DVT or PE in this population. And then in addition to sort of the oncogenic pathways such as TF and ALK, the types of treatment that we give to cancer patients may also drive rates of VTE. These are rates of VTE with immune checkpoint inhibitors. This is obviously a very new class of drugs. At the Cleveland Clinic, we are a large volume center, and we've been using immunotherapy now for a couple of years. So we did a retrospective cohort study of close to 1,600 patients, over 1,600 patients. And we found that about 24% of these patients developed DVT or PE. And similar to what I showed in the chemotherapy era, VTE in immune checkpoint inhibitors was associated with decreased overall survival. Median survival was 365 days with VTE versus 453 days without VTE. So that's a 20% worsening of survival, as you can see in the picture on the right. And this p-value was highly statistically significant. This paper is also in submission. And then if you hone down to specific types of cancers, melanoma, for instance, is very highly associated with the use of immunotherapy. We find that rates of VTE at 12 months here are about 10 to 13% if you're using single agent VTE, almost 20% when you're using a doublet like Ipi-Nivo. This is work presented at ASCO SITC by one of my trainees, Tammy Sussman. And again, we find that no VTE patients have a much better survival than patients who have VTE while on immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. And again, this suggests that patients who develop VTE somehow manifest a greater immunosuppressive phenotype and are able to overcome the effects of immune checkpoint inhibitors. So much more work to be done in this area, but really fascinating to see sort of this field evolve, even with newer drugs and with newer molecular classification. We also have data to suggest that baseline level of MDSCs, MDSCs are myeloid-derived stem cells. And if you have high levels of MDSCs, we believe that that may be associated with increased risk of VT in this population. This is a very small pilot study, and we plan on working on this some more, but leading to more biomarker data in this population. And then finally, we are also funded to study microRNAs in this disease. MicroRNAs are detectable in plasma. They're produced by different types of cells. They're useful in diagnosis of a broad array of cardiovascular diseases. And single microRNAs can regulate many different pathways. So we've developed bioinformatics approaches to network analysis with two of my lab trainees shown at the bottom right, Atira Vijay and Ann Kim. And together they've studied different microRNA profiles in patients with colorectal cancer, as shown up here, and patients with pancreatic cancer, as shown at the bottom. And in both these cancers, we've been able to identify about 30 upregulated mRNAs in patients who developed VTE versus those who did not. In colorectal cancers, about 59 upregulated mRNAs, as well as 71 and 37 downregulated microRNAs as well. So a lot more work to be done here, but we think we're developing a greater understanding and more of a biomarker-based approach to predicting VTE in this population. Now, having said all of that, so understanding that there's risk derived from biomarkers and risk derived from pathophysiology and risk derived from mutation-based analyses, the most important risk, even today in 2020, is driven by clinical risk factors. There's a lot of them. The primary site of cancer, as I mentioned, is a very well-known risk factor. We know that patients with pancreatic cancer or brain tumors, much higher risk. Even within lung cancer, adenocarcinomas are at higher risk than squamous cell cancer, so histology is important, the grade of the tumor. There's definitely treatment-related risk factors. We talked about immune checkpoint inhibitors, but also surgery, hospitalization, chemotherapy, anti-angiogenic therapy is all associated. There's other biomarkers that are more easily available. So the hemoglobin, the platelet count, tissue factor, D-dimer, and so on that we discussed. And then finally, patient-related risk factor. In the United States, African-American patients are more likely to develop clots, and Asian-American patients are less likely to develop clots. About 10 years ago, my group developed a risk score that takes some of the more common clinical risk factors and puts it into a risk assessment tool, which relies on 5 simple variables. The type of cancer, so if you have stomach or pancreas, you get 2 points. If you have lung, lymphoma, GYN, or GEO cancers, you get 1 point. If you have any other cancer like breast cancer or colorectal, you get 0 points. High platelet count, 1 point, low hemoglobin, 1 point, high leukocyte count, 1 point, and a high BMI, more than 35, 1 point. In our initial development and validation cohort, we found that low-risk patients had a very low risk of developing VTE compared to about 7% in high-risk patients, which we defined at the time as a score of 3 or higher. This score has now been validated in over 40,000 plus patients. On the right is our latest validation in 6,000 patients in the United States. And as you can see, you don't necessarily have to cut off at 2 or 3. There's basically a linear increase in rates of VTE the more points that you have. And other investigators have argued, and we now agree that even a score of 2 or higher is associated with a roughly 10% rate of VTE at 6 months. This is from the Vienna group led by Chihan Ai and Ingrid Pabinger, shown on the left. And on the right is a very large meta-analysis of the score in about 35,000 patients with 6-month follow-up in 27,000 patients. And the high-risk score is associated with about, in that population, was associated with about a 9% risk at 6 months. And so the consensus has come around to using 2 as the risk score cutoff for high risk rather than 3, which is what we had originally proposed. This is important for preventing VTE in cancers. I'm going to move now. I've talked a lot about prediction, but prediction is important only if you can use the prediction value to prevention. And so this using scoring tools and then using a score cutoff becomes very important in primary prevention of VTE in cancer patients. How does primary prevention work? There are 2 settings which I will not address today, but I just want to use this slide to say, where primary prevention is widely used and widely recommended. One is major cancer surgeries. So if you have a Whipple resection or a right hemicolectomy, everybody agrees, and this has been agreed upon for decades, that you should receive thromboprophylaxis at least while you're in the hospital, and then for some high-risk patients, major abdominal surgery especially, or pelvic surgery for cancer, up to 4 weeks after the surgery. A second place where everybody agrees is hospitalization. We don't have hospital-specific data in cancer, but based on the medically ill population studied in Medinox, Prevent, and Artemis, most hospitalized cancer patients should receive inpatient thromboprophylaxis for at least as long as they're in the hospital. But most cancer patients receive chemotherapy in the outpatient setting, as shown on the right. And that's where 75 to 80% of all cancer-associated VTE occurs. And so that's where really we can focus on primary prevention. Over the years, multiple clinical trials have addressed this. And just last year, 2 of them were published in the same issue of the New England. And so I'm going to focus on this new paradigm of primary prevention of VTE in the cancer population in the outpatient setting. Just a glance at some of these older studies. The 2 largest were PROTECT with 1,100 patients and SAVE-ONCO with 3,200 patients. Both of them used a daily self-injection of low molecular weight heparin. Both met their primary endpoints in reducing the risk of VTE, but they were not risk-adapted studies. So, remember I talked a lot about using risk prediction to find high-risk patients. And if you do that, then your absolute event rate is high and you're targeting the right population. In these 2 very large studies, very expensive studies, global studies, they did not do risk adaptation. They just gave it to a bunch of cancer patients receiving chemotherapy. And so you see these endpoints here in PROTECT, VTE plus ATE, 3.9% down to 2%. So the number needed to treat to prevent 1 VTE is 53. In SAVE-ONCO, 3.4% down to 1.2%, number needed to treat is 46. These are very high numbers needed to treat, and so even though these studies were statistically significant, they were not considered clinically significant and were not recommended by guidelines to be put into clinical practice. How would risk-adapted prophylaxis work? Well, let's just take one of those studies, PROTECT. As I mentioned, rates were 3.9% down to 2%, but a bunch of patients in that population were low risk, and those patients had almost no benefit because the event rates were so low. Some patients were high risk, and in those patients, you see a much greater absolute risk reduction. And so the number needed to treat drops from 50 for the whole population, goes up to 77 for the high risk population, and down to 15 for the high risk population, 77 for the low risk population. Suggesting that if you find high-risk patients, they'll have a much greater benefit of outpatient prophylaxis. And in fact, in a pooled analysis of SAVE-ONCO, PROTECT, and a third trial that we conducted, FACTS, you see that the relative risk ratio for VTE with prophylaxis is 0.4, which is a 60% relative risk reduction. P-value is highly statistically significant. But this was a retrospective analysis of prospective clinical trials, still does not meet high-grade evidence, and so was glancingly recommended by the guidelines, but not really recommended. A lot changed in 2019 when these two large clinical trials were published in the same issue of the New England, one with rivaroxaban that I had the privilege of leading, and the other with apixaban that was led by Mark Carrier and Phil Wells and a bunch of Canadian investigators. Both these studies used the same approach. They did it risk adapted. So AVERT used patients with a Corona score of 2 or higher, randomized them to apixaban 2.5 milligrams twice daily versus placebo for 6 months, and then patients were followed for DVT-PE or bleeding complications. Cassini also did the same thing, various solid tumors and lymphomas, also the same cutoff score of 2 or higher, randomized to Riva 10 milligram once a day versus placebo. The added issue was doing ultrasounds at baseline, and only if negative then randomizing, and then also doing ultrasounds every 8 weeks while patients were on the study. AVERT is easier to understand because there was no baseline ultrasound, so rates of VTE were 10% in the placebo arm, just what would have been predicted by the score, down to 4%. Hazard ratio is 0.4, p-value is significant. Number needed to treat to prevent 1 VTE is 17. I should point out that 2/3 of these patients had, there was a 2/3 reduction of PE in this population, 16 events down to 5 events. Cassini, a little bit more challenging to understand. The baseline ultrasound removed about 4% of patients who would probably otherwise have developed clots while on the VTE, while on the study. Rates of VTE were, hazard ratio was 0.6, p-value for events up to day 180 was not significant, primarily because 30% of patients stopped taking the drug. If you follow these patients in the intent to treat population while they were on the drug, hazard ratio is 0.4, and this p-value is significant. Number needed to treat is 26. If you also include secondary endpoints such as stroke, MI, arterial events, and some other events, rates are 9% down to 3%. Number needed to treat is similar to AVERT, which is 17. With any primary prevention approach, you're also worried about safety, major bleeding being the greatest adverse effect with this. And as you can see, for both AVERT, number needed to harm is 100, and Cassini, number needed to harm. AVERT and Cassini, the number needed to harm is about 100 for both of them. Meta-analysis of these studies confirms that for when you take both of these studies together, the DOACs, the direct oral anticoagulants, provide a benefit in terms of primary prophylaxis. Risk ratio favors DOACs, as you can see here, confirming the benefit of DOACs for primary prevention of DVT or PE. And as a result, all of the guidelines that have come out since the publication of these two trials over the past few months, all have now added a new recommendation for primary prevention. The ASCO guidelines state that high-risk patients with a score of 2 or higher may be offered prophylaxis with either apixaban, rivaroxaban, or low molecular weight heparin based on the prior clinical trial. ISTH also suggests use of DOACs as primary thromboprophylaxis, same cutoff score of 2 or higher. ITAC, same thing. They call out pancreatic cancer because that's a high-risk cancer. Remember, all pancreatic cancer by definition is a score of 2. And then they also recommend Riva or apixaban in patients who are ambulatory, who are receiving, who have basically a score of 2 or higher, not actively bleeding. So big change in the guidelines as a result of these two large randomized trials. So to summarize, I think I've shown to you that cancer-associated thrombosis is a big clinical problem, unacceptably high burden associated with worsened outcomes, direct association with mortality, indirect association with mortality, risk of hospitalization, prolonged hospitalization, major knowledge gap, why this occurs, we don't still fully understand it. We've made a lot of progress in understanding the pathophysiology of cancer-associated thrombosis, that it's a thromboinflammatory disease. We've identified some novel candidate biomarkers that I talked about, and we've improved risk prediction approaches. And we finally happened upon a new paradigm for primary prevention with the results of Cassini and Evert demonstrating the benefit of low-dose DOACs as primary prevention in high-risk patients. This is now recommended by guidelines, and we really need implementation science approaches to advance these findings and to reduce the public health burden of cancer-associated thrombosis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alok. This was a very fantastic keynote. You addressed some very important points, and we had the honor and privilege of actually seeing face to face the Corona score legend. There have been a lot of very important questions. Unfortunately, we have typed the answers to the questions in the chat box, and I hand over back to the organizers for the next session.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Alok, sir, for the wonderful session. And now we'll move on to our panel discussion. Our chairperson for the session is Dr. Shyam Agarwal. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us for this session. We'll move on to our panel discussion. Our moderator is Dr. Amit Agarwal, medical oncologist from New Delhi. And the panelists are Dr. Hollis D'Souza, specialty senior registrar from Mumbai, Dr. Rakesh Gopal, cardiologist from Chennai, Dr. Nitin Agarwal, cardiologist from New Delhi, Dr. Manikandan Dhanushkodi, medical oncologist from Chennai, Dr. Bharat Rangarajan, medical oncologist from Coimbatore, and Dr. Deepak Padmanabhan, cardiologist from Bangalore. Over to you, Amit, sir.
Can I share my slides now?
Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead, sir. You can do that.
So here we are. Welcome everyone. Moment I get be visible, audible, I guess. Correct?
Yes.
We have got 3 medical oncologists and we have got 3 cardiologists. And I'll be honest with you that I had to read it a bit about this topic. I was kind of very clear about anthracycline and Herceptin, which was discussed last week, but this came as a bit of a surprise. So I would put a disclaimer: this discussion is not aimed at Briggs Brothers HER2 signaling anthracycline. Let's not get confused with the more common and a more studied thing. Few slides to talk before we start involving the panelists and the cardiologist and the medical oncologist. There's a new term in this arena which is called VSP. I am mentioning that because more and more new articles are talking this term, which is vascular endothelial growth factor signaling pathway, and all new articles are using this term. There's so many of them. We use Axitinib, we use Bevacizumab very often, we use Lenvatinib, Pazopanib, Ramucirumab, Regorafenib, less and less of Sorafenib, Sunitinib. We don't have few of them. So I thought, what could be seen? We could see hypertension, we could see possibly coronary arterial events, some dysfunction with low ejection. My question is to have a general feel from my medical oncology and cardiac oncology colleagues. What do you normally see when you use this VEGF inhibitor? We will not talk about Herceptin and equivalents, and we will not talk about the anthracycline. Do you really see them, and how often do you think? So let me start with one. Let's say Dr. Hollis to start with, and then the rest of the 2 people can comment what in their practice they normally feel. I just want to get a feel of what is the magnitude of the problem, and also to the cardiac oncology guys or cardiology guys, do you really get to see these patients treated with tablets with some cardiac issues? And then we'll go to what is the evidence. Hollis, can we start with you?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Thanks. So, sir, definitely hypertension is much more common with Sunitinib and Sorafenib. I'm using in some of my general patients. With Pazopanib, I'm also seeing a lot of hypertension. So, hypertension is one cardiac complication which I feel is much more common than the others. I see maybe in the range of around 20 to 30% of my patients. And severe hypertension, that is one that needs treatment or more than 2 drugs, I'm seeing in around 5 to 10% of my patients. Cardiac dysfunction, drop in EF, I'm seeing in very few patients, around 5 to 10% only.
Oh, wonderful. So you possibly hit the nail on the head. So Manikandan or Bharat, if you have, what do you see? You see hypertension, what Hollis has said is about 20%, 30%. What is your thought process when you prescribe, let's say, Sunitinib, commonest drug we still use Sunitinib, how often, or a Pazopanib?
With Sunitinib and Pazopanib, I see a lot more hypertension than 25 to 30%. even if with the low dose sunitinib or a 2 weeks, 1 week sunitinib, the hypertension seems to be, at least what I see, seems to be more than what is reported, more than 25%. 30 to 40% of patients do develop hypertension at some point of time. There are few reasons for this. One is the bevacizumab patients get monitored more closely. The sunitinib patients,
okay.
especially the ones who are on long-term sunitinib, once they cross their 6 months, 9 months, 1 year time points, they get complacent, we get complacent, and then, we get more hypertensions, when they are in good response. So that is something, long-term effect. The bevacizumab patients invariably get admitted to the daycare, get multiple BP checks, come in more often. So we pick them up a little earlier. But the TKIs are a little bit more dangerous that way.
I agree with you. BEV patient come to take care, they get their blood pressure monitored either in the clinic, so there's a choice. And I think responding TKI patients take long time to come. I completely agree. But I think both of you have said more or less the same thing, that hypertension is a major issue and a cardiac dysfunction and other events are lesser of issue compared to other things. Manikandan, you have something to add to it?
Yeah, so I think mainly in bevacizumab, especially on long duration bevacizumab, we had few patients with uncontrolled hypertension. But with most of the TKIs, we have not had major hypertension because we use predominantly pazopanib, and we have not found major hypertension that is not controlled by drugs. However, we also don't monitor very frequently echocardiogram and so on for patients on oral TKI, except doing blood pressure.
How often do you monitor liver functions on Votrient?
So on oral TKI, we do not monitor
Votrient, only on pazopanib.
So for Votrient, we are doing it at only baseline, and ECG we are monitoring for the first few months, and then mostly we are not monitoring after that.
Okay, you'll be surprised to know that the incidence of hypertension with Votrient is much higher than this. But I believe that the reason so is that we are more lax, as Bharat and Holly said, that I think hypertension is a common problem. But anyway, so I'll go to this meta-analysis.
Can I add something to it? This is Dr. Rakesh Gopal.
Please go ahead. Anytime you have a point to make, please go ahead.
I should say, this hypertension is a rampant problem in patients with cancer per se. Patients with cancer itself is a very big risk factor for developing hypertension. And cancer patients tends to develop worse hypertension than people who do not have cancer. Again, the cancer-related patients, when they develop hypertension and worsen it, they tend to develop more heart failure. Incidence of hypertension, if you really monitor, it's about 70% in people who are treated with TKI. When we are not monitoring, probably we do not know about it. And these patients with cancer or TKI tend to have very labile hypertension. And again, they have an increased incidence of masked hypertension, and they have an increased incidence of, on the certain days, they tend to have a lower BP. And they tend to develop orthostatic hypertension when they put on antihypertensive drugs. So the incidence of hypertension and worsening of the heart failure is very, very common in TKI. Okay. It's about 70%. Its incidence is not very low.
So I'll take it from there. There's a large meta-analysis which comments upon a severe hypertension happening in 7.4%. I think one good way is to see that you need to treat 6 patients to induce a hypertension. You need to treat 17 patients to induce a severe hypertension. If you look at the other numbers, I think it's extremely easy to understand that, as all people are talking about, our load of cardiac problem when we use a VEGF inhibitor is hypertension. This is very unlike anthracycline and Herceptin, which is very unlike anthracycline and Herceptin, where the cardiac ejection fraction issues are also there. So I think this is the point to be taken. I agree the incidence perception between one over the other is different. So there's a question, I mean, you start seeing the patient, as Manikandan said, that we do LFT one time, and I don't know how often do we do. Is there any perception about how much is the time taken to this toxicity of hypertension, what people observe? So we will take it from, let's say, the other way around. Manikandan, you said about LFT. So what do you think, what is the time taken for development of hypertension when you are on VEGF TKI, and then other people, and then I'll take an input from cardiologist also.
I think it can happen as early as in the first month, but usually it happens around the 3 to 6 months. We find that patients develop this, start to develop hypertension, where we need to add antihypertensives for control.
Perfect. So you want it early. What about Bharat and Hollis?
There are actually, with the TKIs, there are actually two groups. People who are already borderline hypertensives, who are on some sort of drugs. We start a TKI, and within the first 1 week or sometimes within the first 1 month, we really see very high BPs, requirement of second drug and sometimes a third drug to be added. That is one group of patients with TKIs. The people who have well-controlled hypertension losing their control. Then the other group is patients who are not really hypertensive, who develop hypertension. This usually I have seen happening after around 6 or even 9 months. And that is a group that sometimes we miss also in an early diagnosis because they don't come that often to us. So both
so you're saying that predisposed patients do worse off
predisposed patients develop very early and may require more drugs, quickly adding on newer drugs, and sometimes they become very refractory. Even addition of 3 drugs, 4 drugs don't control their hypertension sometimes.
In fact, there's a comment somewhere in the articles that it is not known how much the drug itself caused hypertension. These possibly patients are predisposed and they have an ischemic load that will be affected, and the moment you start the drug. So the patients who do not have ischemic load, they do well, and the patient who are just predisposed to multiple problems, they're just waiting for the TKIs to happen.
Ischemic load? What do you exactly mean by ischemic load in hypertension?
So I'll come to a line from one of the articles in the subsequent article. They're trying to say that the patients are at the borderline ischemia or the borderline problem, and the TKI is something which unsettles the equilibrium maintained, and these patients do worse off. This is akin to what Bharat was saying, that patients who are already hypertensive, they do worse off than the patients who are otherwise a normal tensive patient. I think they're trying to use an English literature word, but this is possibly not a proper cardiology word for that, if I could say that.
With TKIs, the major problem is we need really close monitoring. Currently, the ESC
will come to that. I'll come to that.
Quite high.
I'll come to that, sir. So this is one of the articles which actually suggested, as you are alluding to, and I'm sure the rest of the cardiologists will also allude to, that the incidence of hypertension happens actually quite often after the third cycle of 4 week plus 2 week on. So this is generally speaking, if you look at these green lines, even a grade 3 hypertension and a grade 2 hypertension, that seems to happen early, including the dip in the ejection fraction. Completely agreeing to it. It seems it is an early problem. So most of the people are agreeing that it's an early problem, starts around 12 weeks, maybe earlier, as Bharat alluded to, that maybe a predisposed patient earlier. That has an impact on concern that what should we do. So I believe hypertension is a numero uno issue and it happens early. So I wanted to ask, and then I wanted to ask cardiologists, would they agree with or not? What baseline investigations and what follow-up investigation do you do before starting a VEGF inhibitor? Let's start from Hollis down again, and then keep on asking cardiologists they agree with it or they don't agree with it. What do you do? So this is what it is. What baseline investigation do you do? How many of these things do you do? Some of these were alluded to the last week's lecture also, so you'll be fresh with that. How often do you do that? And then we'll come to the guidelines as Dr. Rakesh Gopal was talking to. Hollis.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. I usually at baseline, I start with the cardiac evaluation like ECG and echo I'm doing for all patients. In addition to that, I'm doing lipid profile and other risk factors like I'm doing thyroid profile for all of my patients. I'm doing thyroid profile. I'm doing urine RM for all of my patients.
I was more interested in cardiac issue, but you're right.
Because these are the modifiable factors which can contribute to the hypertension that can be controlled.
Okay. So you do an echo, you do blood pressure monitoring, you do an ECG. What do you look in the ECG? And cardiac markers?
Cardiac markers I'm not routinely doing at base.
Perfect. And what do you look in the ECG?
If there is, ECG, I'm looking both at the QRS, the complex, the QTC interval, and I'm looking at the load. Whether it's specific anything that is there is a chronic hypertension in this patient.
Okay, so if the medical oncologist has anything additional or deletional they want to do in this, and then we'll ask the cardiologist what else they would want to do.
urine analysis, perhaps to look
That's for
at
proteinuria, isn't it?
proteinuria. But many times they correlate also. The nephrotoxicity, proteinuria, hypertension do correlate well. And so that also at baseline.
Okay. Cardiologist, Dr. Nitin Agarwal, Dr. Deepak Padmanabhan, you would like to add something more to it, or you would not like to add something to it? I would come to the ASC, ASI guidelines, which Dr. Rakesh Gopal was. They are very comprehensive. They are more aggressive than we have suggested. I don't think we are following it. And these are guidelines specifically for VEGF therapy. So I want each one to take a question on this. Do you agree? They want baseline investigation. They want GLS also. Last week also discussed. What is our take on that? They want it to be monitored every 3 months with a 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional echo. They want the first follow-up with echo after 1 month, that we don't do. And they guideline include GLS, as I said. And they said you expect a LVF drop by 2% with first cycle and 1.5% with subsequent cycle. So I want, what is the take of both medical oncology and cardiac oncology? Do we follow this as aggressive? Do we need it? Do we not need it? They talk about drop in also. Let's start with the cardiologist. If you have Nitin and Deepak also here.
Yeah, sure. I would agree. I think if you're going to look for a assessment of whether you're going to develop hypertension or not, I think your 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure will be more reliable prior to and in the follow-up. Even if your first dose is going to lead to significant hypertension values, it's important that you have a baseline to start up with. As far as GLS goes, the availability of GLS is not very high. So you will have problems if you try and do GLS on all of your patients, especially in current circumstances. Additionally, there is recent evidence to suggest that you can interpret the ejection fraction on the use of a single 12-lead ECG by using neural network and AI. So that probably, in my mind, is something that is beneficial for actually looking at these patients to understand what is their baseline risk of hypertension, what is their baseline risk of developing LV dysfunction before you start the medication, and then assess these patients subsequently. These are the 3 things I would definitely do. GLS is human mediated, it's human interpreted, and there will be changes according to what the medication does. It's more of an endothelial dysfunction rather than an absolute direct myocardial toxicity. VEGF causes endothelial dysfunction, decrease in the release of nitric oxide, which in turn leads to all of this. So that is not going to work very well otherwise.
Okay, so other cardiologists, Dr. Nitin or Dr. Rakesh, would you like to say that you would like to stick with these guidelines, and most of our patients on VEGF would like to, should likely, ideally undergo? And then last, medical oncologist, we don't do it. I don't do it that often. What would they say about it? Yeah, see, Dr. Rakesh.
You see that hypertension is very common in patients with cancer and patients who are on TKIs. Incidence is very, very high. We really don't monitor. That's why we really do not come across such things. So GLS is to measure the cardiac LV dysfunction. It has got no direct impact with hypertension as such. Unless the patient
is recommending GLS at baseline
and they start developing LV dysfunction. That is a different ball game altogether. But regarding monitoring of the blood pressure, we need to do it frequently initially. I mean, if the patient's BP remains stable, then we do it, call back the patient after 1 month. But typically, what is currently recommended is also to allow the home monitoring of the blood pressure. I mean, even ESC mentions a particular brand itself for using it. I mean, measuring the home blood pressure, and then if the BP tends to go up, these patients require much more close follow-up. So this is
largely more frequent hypertension monitoring. I'm coming to that.
Yes, because
I need to finish few things.
Because the people who are not hypertensive too can develop hypertension, and it can rapidly progress. Patient can develop heart failure, and if the patient already has LV dysfunction, that's why the ESC says about GLS and the LV ejection fraction. If patient has LV dysfunction already, and if he has pre-existing hypertension heart disease, as evidenced in LVH and the ECG, and then these people are more prone for heart failure. So they need very aggressive treatment. And again,
so about cardiologist says that we should try to stick.
Most of the antihypertensive drugs which are currently used will work in TKI-induced hypertension. But there's something very particularly important. Because the TKIs work by nitric oxide inhibition, then in these patients, nitrate will work as an antihypertensive. If you have a resistant hypertension, you can put the patient on oral nitrate tablet, something like isosapide dinitrate or mononitrate. This will work as an antihypertensive in TKI-induced hypertension. And something very important to note is that though many patients who develop hypertension with TKIs, their response to cancer therapy may actually be better because it indicates that TKIs are working as as a vascular.
That's fine, Dr. Rakesh. That's fine, Dr. Rakesh. So let me move to the next because I have allotted time for doing the things. So the guidelines are very clear. I will completely say you're doing the thing which is mentioned that the blood pressure should be monitored every week for the first 8 weeks. And before each infusion, that would mean bevacizumab. And I think they're very clear about that if your blood pressure is more than 140/90, there should be an involvement of cardiologist. And obviously a cardiologist will start thinking about one drug or the other. But I wanted to ask the 3 medical oncologists here before I move to the next one, is that, that aggressive echo and GLS monitoring, do you think it is something you find any, do you think it is practically possible for you at your setup to begin with? Or do you think we got to get used to this guideline which are there for a while? Anybody? Hollis, Manikandan?
Yeah, so in Cancer Institute, at the moment we are monitoring echocardiogram only for anthracyclines and trastuzumab.
Comes as an eye opener for you?
Yeah, so definitely this is an eye opener in terms of the high amount of toxicity. I accept that it is probably because we are not monitoring, we are missing all this hypertension and heart problems, and it needs to be incorporated in our routine practice.
Manikandan, I found it very difficult, but as a cardiologist say, and as the guideline says, widely speaking, yes, I don't know how practical. You find it practical? You will be ready to do it tomorrow? 0, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and BP recording every week?
Yeah, Amit sir, one comment. What is practically feasible and what are the guidelines? What is the meaningful clinical benefit with monitoring of this by this monitoring guidelines? That also needs to be considered.
I agree.
These are guidelines. When we look at the ESMO scale, we should look at the clinical meaningful benefit.
Hollis, I completely agree, but unfortunately, this was an eye opener for me. These are the guidelines. This is what the recommendations are. I completely agree. I guess it is our job to find out what results in what. I completely agree. So I'll come to LV systolic dysfunction. We have only 7-8 minutes left with us. So this is the LV systolic dysfunction guideline. The only thing which I could see separately was, unlike trastuzumab, which we can never do, you can consider at some point of time, even with an ejection fraction of 40%, to reinitiate. We never do it. So this was a different angle which I saw, that you can reinitiate a TKI, unlike, let's say, Herceptin, when ejection fraction reaches 40%. We'll move to QTC because that is something completely new to us. I would say not new to us because we never do it. So anybody from medical oncology side, how often do you do ECG when you do a TKI?
I am actually
every 2 to 4 weeks. They say 2 to 4 weeks.
I am doing it basically at baseline and at 2 weeks. And later on, at least when they come for a follow-up 3 months or so, I'm getting an ECG done and a cardiac. See, most of our patients who develop something go to a cardiologist. So they get an ECG as a sort of routine thing. So that happens for more patients because I think it's a corporate hospital. They have a follow-up routine. They get an ECG at every visit.
Fair. So you read the ECG reading, that's a Bazar's correction, or do you correction by Frederick's correction, which is you can use a medical calculator for that?
It's written on the ECG form usually. The QTC is written there. So I don't.
But if it is Bazar's correction, which is not the right thing, do you do the medical correction?
I do not do that. I don't do that.
Okay, fine. Anybody else who does the correction takes a printout, because you would have realized with glucocycline, ECG is a butter paper, it vanishes. And how many checks the QTC interval drug? It's a great learning thing for me. I'm way inferior to the way the things are said, and I would need a cardiology opinion. What do we do about it? We have not been doing ECGs. What do you say, Manikandan or Hollis?
Yeah, I agree. So routinely, we are not doing ECG for all the patients on TKI. Specifically for some drugs like ribociclib, enzalutamide, arsenic, where we know there is a high risk of QTC, we keep monitoring. But as a routine in Cancer Institute, we are not doing ECG for all patients on TKI.
The easiest
that a
way to
necessary?
look at your QTC is not by taking out a 12 lead ECG. You could do it off a single lead ECG. You do have both AliveCore as well as Sanket Live available in India at present. There is no reason why your own patient can't measure your own ECG at home and send you a copy once in every 3 weeks. It's as good as home BP monitoring. It's something that can be transferred out to the patient. You can actually have ECGs coming back to you with very good QT interval evaluations. Absolutely.
I agree with you, Dr. Deepak. My idea was that we as a medical oncologist have not been doing ECGs except for very few drugs. I wanted as an eye opener that this is an extremely important thing of having an ECG, the self-calculated QTC, or you calculate the QTC, look at the criteria which has been applied. So think about the QTC drug. This is a learning lesson for me, and as these guys are good guys, Bharat, Manikandan and all this, and they're also saying the same thing. I'm just trying to say there is learning involved here.
Absolutely.
One patient came with Votrient and then had a myocardial infarction, and he raised me a question. He's doing very well on Votrient. When can we start it? Hollis, Manikandan, Bharat, and then cardiologist. When would you start post-MI?
I would not start, sir. I would not start post-MI. I would, also there is no recommendation in the packet insert also for pazopanib as such, but I might not start with pazopanib. Sunitinib in some studies has shown to have lesser incidence, so might shift him over to sunitinib.
Okay, fine. What is your answer, Manikandan? Never 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months?
I don't know the answer. I would request the cardiologist to opine on this.
Wonderful, wonderful, great. Bharat?
I actually have a patient like that. I have not restarted. I have kept her on observation after an MI after pazopanib. I've put her on observation basically because her tumor is under control. Now the thing is she could lose control at some point. What do you do? No, I think at this point of time, her EF has improved, her hypertension is controlled, and she's now almost 10 months post-her event. So at next time, if she has a progression, I might reconsider pazopanib.
Okay, so there is some answer in the literature based on VEGF hemodynamics in the myocardium, endocardium, approximately 2 months, you should not start. Obviously, look at the clinical features. Any answer from the cardiology team of ours, if they have any answer on that? There was some very intricate physiology of VEGF and myocyte and endocardium, and I had to chuck the book after reading that, but the last time was 2 months.
I would agree. I think it all depends upon what is your level of systolic dysfunction. At the end of the day, if you're going to have a big LAD infarct with the myocardium already gone, with an ejection fraction of non-reversible ischemia with 35%, you would be very, very worried to start any of your VEGF inhibitors once again, or even TKI once again. But if you're going to have an RCA infarct, you should not have a problem. I think you would read
most patients you can actually restart.
Yeah, that's what.
Like, even people with 5FU, people who have had infarct, but if 5FU is the best drug for them, even 5FU can be restarted in most of the institutions. So it's not that.
So the answer to the question is ask the cardiologist and let them say what is the best time to start. That is not only the right thing.
Work together. Rather than asking the cardiologist.
Yeah, it's always like that. It's always. So let me finish it off. We have got only 2-3 minutes. We should have a baseline investigation, baseline ECG. Please note QTC interval. You're finished with MD medicine. You're back to MD medicine. You can never be a DM cardiologist. You can consider a GLS train, read 18%, -18, -19, -19, -17. It's a good thing to learn. It's a weekly hypertension check. If you can't do weekly, keep a high index of suspicion. It is important. Troponin N at this point of time, or troponin I, we do not know. Let's not do it till it is proven. Hypertension weekly check, LVF check quickly because some patients rapidly deteriorate, as Dr. Rakesh has been after me. I suggest that ECOI should lead protocol. We have 75 members till date. If we can have a protocol, then we'll all be treating in a standardized fashion and we will have a very good data.
Thank you very much, Amit.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you for having me on here.
Presentation. Our chairperson for the session is Dr. Ullas Batra, medical oncologist from New Delhi. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to chair the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kashish, and I think a fantastic discussion, even better than all the debates that we keep on having in medical oncology. So starting from VEGF TKIs to, osimertinib and lung cancer seems to be a very innocuous drug. And I'm sure in the next 15 to 20 minutes, Dr. Vivek and Dr. Hemant and Dr. Ajay Babna are going to tell us it is actually not. Over to Dr. Vivek for our interesting case presentation. And just to set the ball rolling, we actually have a series of 6 patients who have got either a vascular thromboembolism or a decreased ejection fraction on osimertinib, and we've already given it for publication. So hopefully we should have some good comments from here. Over to you, Vivek.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I'll straight away ahead go with this case of mine. I hope my slides are visible well and I'm heard well. So this patient was a 67-year-old male, a non-smoker, known case of diabetes and hypertension, which was controlled on metformin, glimepiride, amlodipine, and atorvastatin. In April 2018, this patient presented with persistent cough and shortness of breathing for 2 months. His baseline ECG echo were unremarkable. Left ventricular ejection fraction was documented 60%. And after detailed evaluation, he was diagnosed with metastatic adenocarcinoma lung with a left lower lobe primary with bilateral lung nodules. So this patient was further evaluated and diagnosed to have EGFR exon 19 deletion mutation positive. And then he was started on first line osimertinib 80 milligram once daily from April 2018. He had a very good clinical response to his symptoms and tolerated well with some grade 1 skin dryness and grade 1 diarrhea. Now, 3 months later, this patient was admitted in emergency for acute onset shortness of breathing. He did not have any fever, cough or chest pain. BP was 110/70, pulse was 122/30 per minute regular. There was no pedal edema. And chest X-ray and contrast CT scan of the thorax showed bilateral pleural effusion and ground glass haziness in bilateral upper and lower lobes. So my first impression was that I was surprised that osimertinib is not working and this patient has probably progressed. So these are his baseline X-ray, and we can see this is actually an AP view, and there is bilateral haziness, bilateral pleural effusion. This is the CT image that he has, and what I actually found is that although there was bilateral pleural effusion, but his primary mass, which is there in the left side, was actually a bit lesser, and some of the nodules had actually responded and vanished. So the ECG showed sinus tachycardia, and echocardiography showed generalized wall hypokinesia with left ventricular systolic dysfunction, dilated left ventricle and left atrium with an ejection fraction of 35%. His NT-proBNP was very high, above 6,000, and TROP-I was actually found to be normal. Blood cultures were negative, so there was no sepsis. This was his echo images, and we can see the ejection fraction as 37%. So pleural effusion was drained and was sent for evaluation. It came out to be transudative. Culture was negative. Cytology, which was sent twice, was negative for malignant cells. Cardiology opinion was taken because it was heart failure, and patient was managed conservatively with diuretics, furosemide, spironolactone, ramipril, and ivabradine to control the rate. And the patient gradually improved. Pleural effusion resolved with this heart failure management. This is the X-ray before and after the treatment. We had actually inserted a chest drain, not knowing that it was just heart failure. So, but the chest, effusion resolved on the other side also very easily with the heart failure management. This patient actually on discharge, I had restarted on osimertinib, but then this patient had actually went to a colleague in Kolkata only, who actually called me up and told that Vivek, this case seems to be one of those rare cases of osimertinib induced cardiotoxicity, which I didn't know in 2018. So then when I read about it, I switched him to gefitinib 250, and then he tolerated well. Further echo at 3 and 6 months did not show any improvement in the ejection fraction. December 2018, he was responding to gefitinib also. In April 2019, then he had a progressive disease with new sclerotic bone mets and increase in the lung primary. Then his ejection fraction had returned to 50%, but there was some mild global hypokinesia. The heart failure management was going on with the cardiologist. A liquid biopsy with EGFR was done, and it was found to be negative. So we started on chemotherapy, 4 cycles PEM carbo with zoledronic acid, tolerated well. He had good response to it. 8 cycles of pemetrexed maintenance, and then in December 2019, This patient again progressed with new adrenal mass, new bone lesions, and intramuscular deposits. Now, at that time, the liquid biopsy showed both EGFR exon 19 as well as T790M mutation positive. Patient's ECOG was, PS2. Ejection fraction had normalized. There was no hypokinesia, and it was 55% ejection fraction. So we started osimertinib, and then almost 2 weeks after we started osimertinib, this patient was again admitted in emergency with altered sensorium, severe bone pains, and a fall at home. His ejection fraction at the time of admission was found to be normal, 60%, but he was having some severe hyponatremia, mild hypokalemia. A contrast CT brain was done, which showed a large bilateral parenchymal and small subdural hemorrhages without any scalp or bone injury. So my radiologist told it is likely a cerebrovascular attack or a stroke. An MRI brain was also done, and it confirmed there was no metastasis. This is the CT brain, which showed that there were 2 hemorrhagic lesions and the scalp bone was normal. He told that it is most likely a rare case of stroke and hemorrhage occurring bilaterally in both the hemispheres. Now this patient was having very poor PS, so there was no clinical improvement on supportive care, so it was planned for palliative and best supportive care. And then he subsequently expired after the 2 weeks of admission. So we never know whether this was again an osimertinib related some cardiovascular event. So there are other multiple case series. This is a case series of 5 patients from Italy. Again, there were patients who immediately deteriorated and expired after osimertinib, but there were also patients who had tolerated osimertinib rechallenge, but they had again had some sort of a cardiovascular event or decreased in the left ventricular ejection fraction after some time. This is another case, two patients, again, both expiring because of osimertinib cardiotoxicity. This is another interesting case where myocarditis happened, and then they subsequently this is the left ventricular dilatation, and they subsequently did an endomyocardial biopsy, which actually showed lymphocyte infiltration, lipofuscin deposition, edematization, but there was no cardiac muscle hypertrophy, cardiac fibrosis, or no inflammatory cell infiltrate or myocyte disarray. So some sort of knowledge on what may be the pathology behind this. And this is again a case series of 123 patients leaving QTC. In this Japanese paper, they documented 4.1% incidence of cardiac events. And again, one data from India, 90 patients on osimertinib, but no specific mention of specific cardiovascular toxicities, but 3 cardiovascular deaths on treatment. So we don't know whether osimertinib related or not, but documented 3 deaths. So osimertinib cardiotoxicity is a reality. 4% incidence. It is much more common than the rare mutations that we actually look for in the lung cancer. So we need to monitor and look for it. And I will ask my cardiologist friend now to really elaborate on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vivek. Fantastic. And I can actually relate to you because we also had some patients who had this. Now for the expert cardiology overview, can I please invite Dr. Hemant Madan?
Yeah, thank you, Ullas and Vivek. I mean, expecting me to have expert views on a disease like this is really, it's beyond me. Osimertinib is I've also read up only after Vivek put me in this in this symposium. But there are a couple of things, incidentally, my DM thesis was on anthracycline-induced cardiotoxicity. And if I was to follow the same parameters as what we used to do, maybe 2 decades ago, is what would be the risk profile of patients who are likely to get osimertinib cardiotoxicity? That's a key issue. Will we be able to identify patients earlier? Will we be able to predict that these are the patients who are likely to get osimertinib-induced cardiotoxicity? And thirdly, whether this is a dose-related effect or this is an idiosyncratic effect. These are the 3 key parameters to my mind. Of course, treatment of cardiac failure in these patients remains more or less similar to what any other idiopathic myocarditis or drug-induced myocarditis would be treated like. You give some diuretics, you give a newer form of drugs. I'm surprised Vivek's patient did not get those. There's a newer form of drugs called ARNIs, which is angiotensin receptor neprilysin inhibitors, which is basically drugs which act on the pathophysiological mechanism of heart failure. Obviously, because longevity of these patients may not be too much, so we don't generally give device treatment like AICDs or CRTDs for these patients, because from a cardiological perspective, a minimum lifespan of 6 months to 1 year should be there before we start bunking in devices. So having said that, I think, there's only one endomyocardial biopsy. Let me assure my oncology colleagues that endomyocardial biopsy is a very simple and a safe procedure. It's done through the internal jugular vein. It's almost like an OPD procedure, even though it sounds very scary. If I was to decide in Asian Cardio Onco Society as to what the future direction should be, I would suggest that we should look at doing some more endomyocardial biopsies to look at whether it's a direct myocardial effect or whether it's an inflammatory immunological kind of response. I could only find one case report which Vivek has alluded to, which showed lymphocyte proliferation. I'm not sure whether it's an alcohol-like effect. Alcohol causes cardiomyopathy, but direct myocardial toxicity. One biopsy is just too little. So my suggestion would be that whenever we encounter such a case, we should encourage or try to get an endomyocardial biopsy, maybe not from therapeutic perspective in an individual case, but from trying to find the pathophysiology of heart failure in these patients. Ullas and Vivek, if you have any comments, I welcome them.
Thank you, sir. I mean, that's a nice overview. I think we will take the questions at the end of the session once we also hear from Dr. Ajay Bapna. So, sir, from an expert oncological preview about osimertinib-induced cardiac failure, over to you, Dr. Ajay Bapna. Is Dr.
Ajay, sir, are you able to hear?
Yeah, thank you, Lars.
My God, can I just interrupt you for a second? I saw 21 slides, sir.
No, it will finish in 5 minutes. Vivek had 26, don't be partial to me.
I don't even know anything about this, and you 21 slides. I was thinking of resigning today.
Vivek had 26. Don't be partial to me. So why it is important to know that the osimertinib causes the cardiotoxicity? Because as the treatment with osimertinib become more common now, concerns have been raised regarding rare but potentially serious cardiac toxicity, which historically have not been reported. So this was alluded by the previous speakers also. And this was the one very important paper which was published in JACC. And this was the first large systemic effort to quantify the risk of cardiac toxicity, such as QTc prolongation and the cardiac failure with osimertinib. And the importance of this article lies in the fact that there was an accompanying editorial also. And the osimertinib, as we all know, that it gained the first US FDA approval in the United States in 2015, 4790 and positive NSCLC, and the patient who had progressed with the standard EGFR TKI. And more recently, the osimertinib showed improved outcome in frontline setting in patients with EGFR mutated NSCLC compared with the standard EGFR TKI, leading to osimertinib being the preferred TKI. So this was the reason that we need to discuss about everything about the osimertinib, because it will be used more and more in our patients. So the present study, which I had alluded, involved the data queries from the FAIRS database between1st January 2016 and September 30th, 2018. And it has compared the osimertinib, erlotinib, afatinib, as well as the gefitinib. The only EGFR TKI with more than 100 adverse events in the database were chosen for analysis, and decominative was excluded from the FAIR study. So in this pivotal study, although osimertinib was associated with fewer grade 3 and 4 adverse events compared with the standard EGFR TKI, which was 34% versus 45%. And the osimertinib was associated with an increased risk of cardiotoxicity compared with the control arm. Specifically, need to be informed that there was a grade 3 or higher QT prolongation was reported higher in the osimertinib arm. However, a meta-analysis of pivotal study showed that osimertinib was associated with not only an increased risk of QT prolongation, but also an increased risk of cardiac failure. So both higher QT prolongation as well as the increased incidence of the cardiac failure. So this was all the list of the cardiac event, and it will summarize in this table that the cardiac failure with osimertinib in this FAIR trial was seen in 2.3% of the patient, atrial fibrillation in 1.2%, QTC prolongation in 1.3%, myocardial infarction in 0.7%, and pericardial effusion was also seen in less than 1% of the patient. When you compare to the other TKI, the incidence of these cardiac events are much more higher when we use the osimertinib, which is clearly shown in this slide. And when we look at the disproportionality signal analysis calculated reporting odd ratio, it confirms that the cardiac failure, atrial fibrillation, QT prolongation, and myocardial infarction and pericardial effusion are much more than the other TKIs. So this is a cartoon which is showing that the osimertinib versus other EGFR TKI, the pharmacovigilance database, that QTC prolongation is 6.6% more, increased ROR for cardiac failure is 2.2% more, and increased ROR for atrial fibrillation is 2.1% more when we use osimertinib in comparison to the other TKIs. So this was a real world data which was published in the JACC on this issue, and this is the first study to describe the osimertinib associated cardiac events in the real world Japanese NSCLC population. And what was informed in this publication that osimertinib definitely leads to the cardiac dysfunction, and also it was interesting to know that it also causes the progression of the valvular disease and it precipitates the myocardial infarction. So how do we manage the cardiotoxicity of osimertinib? If the QTC prolongation is more than 500 milliseconds or at least on two separate ECG, we need to withhold the Tagrisso until QTC is less than 481 milliseconds, or recovery to the baseline if baseline QTC is greater than or equal to 481 milliseconds, then resume at 40 milligram dose. QTC interval prolongation with sign and symptoms of life-threatening arrhythmia, we need to permanently discontinue. Similarly, if there is an asymptomatic absolute decrease in the left ventricular ejection fraction of 10% from baseline or below 50%, then withhold Tagrisso for up to 4 weeks. If improved to baseline left ventricular ejection fraction, we can resume the osimertinib. If not, then improve to baseline, we need to permanently discontinue the osimertinib. If there is a symptomatic heart failure, it is a common sense that we need to permanently discontinue. So to summarize, the risk of osimertinib cardiotoxicity should inform baseline testing and the monitoring. The observed risks are not sufficient to warrant change in the prescribing the osimertinib because it's a very important drug. What remains most critical is determining the best approach for baseline testing and on-treatment monitoring to allow identification of potentially serious toxicities early enough to intervene. For patients found to have an asymptomatic decrease in the left ventricular ejection fraction, the appropriate frequency of monitoring and efficacy of dose reduction remains unknown, while holding osimertinib can have dramatic negative consequences because it's a very important drug to treat the EGFR mutated non-small cell carcinoma in the metastatic setting. So for now, the provider should be aware of osimertinib induced cardiotoxicity and consider it in the differential for patients on the medication who are having shortness of breath, volume overload, palpitation, or other potentially relevant cardiovascular symptoms. So my personal experience of any cardiotoxicity with osimertinib, yes, I have one patient who presented with the cardiac tamponade. To summarize the trial data, in FAIRS, a pharmacovigilance database, following cardiac abnormalities were found to be higher due to osimertinib. That were rates of QT prolongation, cardiac failure, and atrial fibrillation. ECG monitoring for QT prolongation and monitoring for signs and symptoms of heart failure should be considered while taking osimertinib in all patients. So, and the conclusion from the real world data that in retrospective cohort analysis, the incidence of cardiac events in patients treated with osimertinib was 4.9%, and additional prospective data collected from patients with NSCLC treated with osimertinib will be important in understanding the incidence, pathophysiology, and and management of the cardiac adverse event with osimertinib. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Okay, I mean, that was fantastic. And I think we are already over shooting our time. So before Dr. Purvesh Parekh, mutes me, I think Dr. Shyam Agarwal has a question. And Dr. Parekh, I have a point. This is the first time I have seen you giving 10 minutes extra to Dr. anyone. And that's Dr. Shyam Agarwal. So I would like to know the reason for that. Now the question from Dr. Shyam Agarwal is, what is the reason for myocyte injury by osimertinib? Is it a specific to EGFR third generation inhibitors, or is it like okay with it is not seen with gefitinib? So maybe Dr. Bapna can take it.
What was your question, Gulas?
So the question is that why do we see the cardiac injury only with osimertinib and not with gefitinib or erlotinib? Is it a specific EGFR mutation inhibitor, or is it common with everyone?
Not all. Not all. As I have enumerated that it was much more common with osimertinib rather than other.
So the reason for that, sir?
Yeah, maybe some at the molecular level, or maybe at the myocardial level. The Vivek has shown one slide.
Yeah. So just like there is cardiotoxicity with anti-HER2 drugs. So we must know that anti-HER2, they fall against the larger group of EGFR receptors only. And there has been some data that the osimertinib also causes HER2 inhibition. So this is probably one of the reasons that in the myocytes they are also inhibiting HER2, and HER2 receptor is important for myocyte survival. So that is the reason why it is there with osimertinib and not with the other.
That's the reason why I was saying that probably in times to come we can be a little liberal with consideration of endomyocardial biopsy, because that will clearly show us whether there is myocardial death and apoptosis or whether it's an immune mediated kind of a response.
So how do we do this endomyocardial biopsy? I mean, it looks scary enough. I mean, sounds scary enough.
Well, it's very simple actually. You go through the jugular vein like you put in any central line, and there's an instrument called a bioptome which has a small forceps at the end of it, and it preferentially goes through the jugular vein into the right atrium, right ventricle, and then you take a biopsy on the septum, on the interventricular septum. Interventricular septum is usually very thick, and these biopsies are usually 3 millimeter biopsies. There are two types of bioptomes available, 3 millimeter and 5 millimeter bioptomes. So we can take a 3 to 5 millimeter sample, and actually, you take multiple biopsies. Like once you put in the sheath, you take about 5 or 6 biopsies so that the pathologist never gets to say that sample is inadequate.
You can never be sure of that, sir, unless it is an autopsy. Sometimes autopsy also they say sample is less. And can I ask you the cost of that, sir, approximately?
Well, it's not, just a few minutes back, Randeep asked me the same question. See, obviously, bioptome is about 20,000 to 25,000, but it's a reusable kind of a, device. And the rest is very simple. It's like putting a central line. So and the curvature of the bioptome is such that it preferentially goes into the towards the septum. So you actually, in a case of heart transplant, a biopsy is done every week to identify early rejection. So if you work in a heart transplant center, you end up doing a biopsy every week. It's very simple.
Hemant, there's an issue here. Actually, in these two incidences, like if you have an immune myocarditis, it's actually an inflammation which is immune mediated. But here, the LV dysfunction which occurs with these drugs, osimertinib and anthracyclines are two different classes.
We don't know the cause.
We know the cause. We know the cause. The anthracyclines, the cause of LV dysfunction is myocyte necrosis.
Yeah, apoptosis.
In Herceptin and it's not apoptosis, it is necrosis. When the LV dysfunction is reversible, like for Herceptin, it's actually a problem with the myocardial energy kinetics. It's actually uncoupling of the energy mechanism that is leading to LV dysfunction in these people when the LV dysfunction and myocyte recovery is complete. So these are two different. Now we have inflammation.
So
Dr.
you would
Gopal and
recommend
Dr.
not going for
Hemant.
biopsy at all? Is that what
No,
you're recommending?
it's not that not recommend. Biopsy is not the answer. Biopsy is the answer when you suspect an inflammation, like you find an immune myocarditis or autoimmune myocarditis.
No, the point I'm trying to make is that we don't know what's causing this. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Actually, we know the reversible etiology is due to an uncoupling of the energy when the myocardium.
So
When the
Okay. Dr. Rakesh Gopal and Dr. Hemant Madan. It is so nice to see you guys. So, you know, okay, fantastic. So I think we'll just go to the last question from anonymous Dr. Shyam Agarwal, which is like, Dr. Vivek, so after you had this patient, do you have an echo prior to osimertinib, and how do you follow these patients?
Yes, sir, always. So always now before starting, I make it a point that there should be a baseline echo, and I never used to monitor the echo on patients on osimertinib, but now no, other TKIs I'm not monitoring, but on osimertinib, at least every 3 monthly, I am monitoring the echocardiography now.
Yeah, I mean, and same here actually that we are doing. So, I mean, is there a data of restarting osimertinib after somebody has developed ejection fraction? I mean, you showed that in your case. What would you do next time?
So again, sir, I would be very, very cautious when I am restarting, because there have been case reports where on restarting again there has been a drop in the ejection fraction, and sometimes these drops in the ejection fraction are fatal. There are patients who would be developing fatal events, and sometimes there have been documented MIs or strokes. For example, in my patient, when I restarted 2 weeks later, he had a stroke. Now I don't know whether it was actually an osimertinib related event or whether it was actually unrelated event. It is very difficult to answer, but I think the word is that we have to be very cautious whenever we are restarting osimertinib. Probably a patient who can is his PS is good enough to withstand a second cardiac event. If a patient is having a poor PS and you think that is not be able to withstand a second cardiac event, probably it is not a good idea to restart, because the documentation is that the patient will again develop a drop in the ejection fraction.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Vivek. And just to this last comment from my side, we do echo regularly for all of our patients prior to starting osimertinib, and in fact we repeat it every 2 months because once bitten, twice shy, and we have been bitten 6 times, so we are 12 times shy. And with this, I would like to thank the organizers for a wonderful discussion, for an out-of-box thinking, for something which is very, very, very practically relevant. Thank you, Dr. Parekh, for having the meeting, for actually allowing me to be a part of it. Thank you, sir. Back to the organizers.
Thank you so much, sir. I now request Dr. Parekh to please give the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
A vote of thanks is given by me. Now I hand over to Vivek for his concluding remarks.
So I thank everybody. I think we had a wonderful discussion today. I think the lecture by Dr. Alok Khurana was really mesmerizing. I think we have been underestimating the thromboembolic events that we have in our patients. There were a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions, and the audience had a lot of questions. We would try to get to Dr. Khurana so that we can get some answers from him. But it was a wonderful session. Again, TKI and VEGF induced hypertension, and I think we had a very wonderful debates as well as some relevant points coming in that. Again, a very different topic, and probably not discussed in most meetings, these aspects, but we had a wonderful discussion. Osimertinib induced cardiotoxicity, again, it is a learning point for me as well as I think hope for everybody else. So a fruitful meeting today, and looking forward to the next meeting. So I again invite you to inform you that today is the last day for being a founder member of Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. You will get the links in the chat box. Kashish will post it. So if you have not taken the membership, today is the last day, after which probably we will decide how to go about the membership in the general body meeting. And I invite you again next Thursday, 7 o'clock, for the third series of our Asian Cardio-Oncology Society meeting. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for the good response. Good night.
Thank you so much, sir.